Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Vicki Hallett and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Gender Studies here at Memorial University. Today I'd like to share a short presentation with you entitled Newfoundland and Labrador Women, Creating Place Through Story. As a Newfoundlander and as a gender studies scholar, and someone who just loves a good yarn, as we call it here in Newfoundland and Labrador, I've based my research around Newfoundland and Labradorians who make this place what it is. I think that we make place through the stories we tell about it. We create our sense of place, of who we are, but also our sense of where we are and where we belong by telling tales. Are all of these tales true? Not at all. And frankly, I'm not particularly bothered by that. Remember, I'm not a historian. I'm interested in how we tell the truth and in how we lie. And I'm interested in how we do both at once. You see, I study something called life narratives, which means I study the stories that we tell about our lives. It's not strictly autobiography, but a much broader umbrella term that includes stories we tell about our lives in various and perhaps unexpected formats. Things such as letters and diaries, but also more unusual things like tattoos, songs, performances, recipe books, and poetry, just to name a few. And as you might expect, when we tell the stories of our lives, sometimes we stretch the truth, or tell the truth as we understand it, or tell the truth as we've been told it. All of which means that we create and recreate our own mythologies and histories blended together to form our understanding of who we are and where we're from. I study the ways that we do that and why that matters, all through the lens of gender. Today, I'd like to tell you about two particularly fascinating women whose stories I've been engaging with for a number of years. Newfoundland poet and postmistress Phoebe Florence Miller, and Labrador storyteller and story collector Doris Saunders. Phoebe Florence Miller lived her entire life from 1889 to 1979 in Topsail, a small community on the shores of Conception Bay South. Her life was not defined through marriage and children, but instead by a love of writing and nature, family and friends. And while she's an obscure figure today, in 1937, Gerald S. Doyle labeled her the Poetess Laureate of Newfoundland. A descendant of Topsail's founding European settler families, Miller was educated at the Methodist School, where she completed a grade 11 education. A dedicated poet from the age of 10, her eventual career as postmistress would allow her to pursue her twin passions of enjoying nature and writing for most of her life. She and her sister, Alice, tended a beautiful garden on the grounds of their Topsail home, where old trees flourished to shelter myriad flowers and shrubs, and a plot of vegetables thrived there for many years. She kept an old hammock in which to swing while gazing on the forget-me-nots that grew in abundance, and from which she could look out to her favorite vista, the wide expanse of Conception Bay, with its trio of small islands. Beyond the garden, Miller also loved to wander in the woods and over the hills surrounding the town. In winter, she loved to skate over frozen ponds and ski and snowshoe through the forest paths. It was often from her love of nature that she took inspiration for her poetry, which was widely published in Newfoundland during her lifetime. The Newfoundland Quarterly published 44 of her poems from 1916 through 1956. Other prominent Newfoundland publications to feature her work were the St. John's daily newspaper, the Evening Telegram, and the quarterly publication of the Great War Veterans Association, The Veteran, which would publish 31 of Miller's pieces, starting in 1921. Miller also published a book of her poetry entitled In Caribou Land with Ryerson Press in 1929. In addition to her extensive poetry, much of it unpublished, Miller's archival record, kept at the archives and special collections of Memorial University, contains many examples of her multifaceted literary personality. The archives reveal that she also wrote greeting card verses for companies like Hallmark. She kept extensive diaries and was a loyal correspondent. She also entered handmade journals in Dr. Chase's Almanac Great Diary Writing Contest in the 1920s. And she wrote a radio play, Songs of Seven, which was broadcast over radio station KDKA in Pittsburgh on November 17, 1926. Later in her life, she wrote short amateur histories of the town of Topsail, the Methodist United Church in Topsail, and of the Newfoundland families, the Millers and Allens among them, who settled in that same community in 1820. Most of her writing was accomplished in what she called her Blue Castle, Miller's room of her own, where she also hosted friends and fellow writers in a kind of rustic literary salon. This space was a mixture of the European salon and the Newfoundland kitchen party. It was a place created through Miller's love of poetry, love of Newfoundland, and love of friends. Overlooking Conception Bay, the cozy room became a haven for aspiring writers, a crucible of lifelong friendships, and an extension of the poet herself. As she wrote in her award-winning journal from 1920, quote, "It is a quaint, low-ceilinged room with beams and old blue walls into which I have gathered all my inanimate beloveds. Here are my bookshelves, magazines, music, and fancy work materials, and woodsy finds, firelight too, and softly shaded lights, all of which tells the story of my days." Phoebe Florence Miller was able, through her writing and her writing life, to create multiple impressions of Newfoundland through a series of spaces, both real and imagined, that were important to her. Topsail, her family's garden, her home, the Blue Castle. These spaces, in turn, defined her multifaceted identities through their influence on her writing. In fact, many of Miller's poems were written in local dialect, and she recognized that this was both important and problematic. As she wrote, quote, "The Newfoundland dialect is a joy forever, for it beggars all efforts to set it down correctly. There's no spelling for some of the words. Moreover, there's no saying this is right and that is wrong with regard to it, for what is typical talk in one cove of the bay may be altogether different from that spoken in the very next." In fact, one of my favorite poems is a dialect poem entitled On the Point a Saturday, which is written from the perspective of a young child who loves to wander on the beach. Hi there. Here's Phoebe Florence Miller's poem, On the Point a Saturday. "Come along, old Saturday, 'cause I'm aching just to go up long shore to Chatlin's Point where the periwinkles grow. Where, way out upon the crags, brown kelp's washing in the sea, and 'tis bully climbing around. Oh, come on, old Saturday. Where the periwinkles grow, there's always mussels too, tangled in their seaweed homes, and their shells is dark and blue, like the old sea when it storms. Gotta take off shoes and socks and wade over kelpy stones for to dig 'em off the rocks. Beach is different from our own. Ours is only just but stones. On the point there's bully things. Whiten conchs and bleaching bones, bits of shell that looks like pearl, driftwood that's smooth and old. Maybe someday among the rocks we may find a chest of gold. Little sails that looks like dreams on the fishing boats outside, and a kind of music made by the lapping of the tide. Little shellfish, shh, oh shh, comes the old sea's lullaby. My, now spring's here, I just wish every day was Saturday. Modern critics find Miller's work to be significant for its use of a vernacular Newfoundland English. Poet laureate of St. John's, Mary Dalton, writing about Miller and her contemporary Georgina Cooper, who lived from 1885 to 1980, says that by using language in this way, the poets are, quote, trying as best they can to render the speech of their place, as well as its people and their relation to place. Whatever ambivalence and contradictions one may find in their creations, they're working to move out from under the colonialist perceptions which hampered so many of the earlier writers. Thus, in this way, Dalton places Miller in a category of Newfoundland poets from the early 20th century to today, who have tried with varying degrees of success to depict the place, its people, in local language and idiom in order to, quote, win through to the distinctive elements of their own culture and to recognize the authenticity of their own speech. This impetus to celebrate and preserve one's culture through speech and story is something that ties Miller to another remarkable coastal woman, Doris Saunders of Labrador. Doris Saunders was of a different generation and different place than Miller. Born in Cartwright, Labrador in 1941, Saunders would spend most of her life in Happy Valley Goose Bay and become well known as the founding editor of Them Days magazine. For her work with the magazine in preserving and promoting Labrador's histories and cultures, she would receive the Order of Canada in 1986 and an honorary Doctor of Laws from Memorial University in 1994. Most importantly to me, however, is that Saunders shared a love and dedication to place with Miller, as well as a determination to live life on her own terms, which is something I admire a great deal. Saunders defined herself as a Labradorian of Inuit, Innu, and European heritage. She married her husband, Frank, in 1960, and they had 3 children. She signed on as Them Days founding editor in 1974, when the idea was floated to write a book about Labrador history and culture, using Labradorians' own stories and words. To say that she had no idea what she was getting into would be an understatement. The response to the initial call for stories and remembrances for this book was overwhelming, and almost immediately the book became a series, which became a magazine that is still being published today. That magazine has also published numerous books about Labrador and its peoples, and developed an archive, which is housed in Happy Valley Goose Bay, that is overflowing with veritable treasure trove of materials, such as photos, letters, taped interviews. Saunders' initial 3-month contract turned into a 30-year career. And while Saunders was not single-handedly responsible for these accomplishments, she certainly had a hand in much of it. Along with a dedicated team of volunteers, and eventually some other paid staff, Saunders would oversee the magazine's development through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, as it became the venerable Labrador institution that it is today. Saunders would act as editor, but also as interviewer, photographer, designer, archivist, and general doer of all things that needed to be done. In her address to Memorial University graduates in 1994, the newly minted Dr. Dora Saunders said this about the founding of the magazine. Quote, "The idea was to let the rest of the world, and in particular the island portion of our province, understand the real Labrador as experienced by the people of Labrador." In her dedication to doing that very thing, Saunders tried to represent the people who shared their stories in their own words. This meant transcribing interviews verbatim and printing them the same way. When it was economically feasible and translators could be found, Saunders also tried to include stories in their original Indigenous languages, either Inuktitut or Inuaimun, with an English translation. As the great-great-granddaughter of the famous Labrador diarist Lydia Campbell and grandniece of Elizabeth Gowdy, author of the famous Woman of Labrador, Saunders saw herself as a link between Labrador's past, its present, and its future, and she understood stories to be crucial to this. Speaking about her identity as a Labrador Inuit woman and editor of Them Days, at an Inuit roundtable on education, language, and culture in Tuktoyaktuk in 1993, Saunders said, quote, "My dad always told me that anything worth having is worth working for. Based on that, them days must surely be worth a lot. He also said that anything worth doing is worth doing right, and that I have tried to do. When the struggle becomes too burdensome, I will retire, knowing that I have succeeded in continuing the work started when my great-great-grandmother, Lydia Campbell, began writing sketches of her life on December 25th, 1893. That work was keeping Labrador history alive, but also keeping the voices of Labradorians alive. Now, I think that these are very cool women, as you can probably tell. But that doesn't mean they were always perfect or always well behaved. This is not a talk about saints, after all. But then again, as historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich has written, well-behaved women seldom make history. And I think that both of these women did make history, and in doing so, contributed to making this place